know that the Atlantic slave trade was the largest oceanic forced migration in history? The majority of African slaves in the pre-colonial Africa came from the areas in which the transatlantic slave trade was most active in East and West Africa. The Atlantic slave trade was the most tragic event in human history because of how it displaced millions of Africans from their homes and began a legacy of oppression for the descendants generations to come. And this human tragedy is not even taken into account. So, here are the top 10 African tribes taken in the Atlantic slave trade. At number 10, we have the Wolof tribe. The Wolof constitute a large ethnic group inhabiting the West African country of Senegal, a former French colony, and Gambia, a former British colony. Wolof is the name by which the people refer to themselves, and it is also the name of their indigenous language. They manifest a highly conscious sense of ethnic identity and ethnic pride. The Wolof were made up of a variety of separate kingdoms, and constant wars among them led to enslavement amongst the Wolof, particularly with the arrival of Islam in Senegal, which was accompanied by jihad. Internal Wolof jihads resulted in internal displacement and prisoners of war, who were then traded as slaves. Number 9, we have the Chamba. The Chamba are a significant ethnic group in the northeastern Nigeria. The Chamba are located between present-day Nigeria and Cameroon. In Nigeria, they lived primarily in Gongola State, especially in the Ver, Wafanga, and Binyeri districts of Adamawa Division, the Leko, Jada, Mbulo, Tugu, Yelwa, and Tongo districts of Ganye Division, and the Dakar, Jalingo, Mutum, Biu, Bukundi, and Gasso districts of Muri Division. There are two ethnic groups in Ghana and Togo, also called Chamba, but they are ethnically distinct. The Chamba are identified through their own language, beliefs, culture, and art. The Chamba speaks two distantly related languages, Chamba Leko of the Leko-Nimbari languages and Chamba Daka of the Dakoid languages, both of which are Niger-Congo languages. The Chamba were constantly raised by Fulani slave traders during the jihads of the 18th and 19th centuries. Eventually, in order to prevent themselves from being taken as slaves, the Chamba resorted to a resistance campaign in which they retreated to the mountains and attacked slave trading caravans. This had the desired effect and led to less people amongst the Chamba being taken in as slaves. At number 8, we have the Fulani. The Fulani are one of the largest, if not the largest ethnic group in West Africa, from Senegal all the way up to the Central African Republic. The Fulani converted to Islam very early in their history and were the primary slave raiders in West Africa, responsible for selling many African ethnic groups into slavery as they waged jihad accompanied by slave raiding missions. Inasmuch as the Fulani were very active as slave traders, they were also amongst the most enslaved African tribe. Various Fulani groups would enslave others in the name of religion, particularly if they did not ascribe to Islam. So Fulani groups that were not Islamic were also victims of the slave trade. For number 7, we have the Mende. The Mende people are a collection of ethnic groups all over West Africa that speak the Mende language, with the most widely recognized Mende-speaking nation being the Mandinka nation. The Mandinka built one of the largest empires in West Africa, becoming so prominent that the term Mandingo was coined in reference to their reputation as strong black men. Mandinka culture was the most dominant in West Africa from around 1100 BC all the way to 1600 AD, when the Mandinka kingdoms around the coastline of West Africa fell victim to the slave trade. Today, the memory of the Mandinka and their history in the transatlantic slave trade has been immortalized in the story of the Amistad slave ship. At number 6, we have the Fon people. The Fon are the largest ethnic group in Benin and can also be found in parts of southern Nigeria. During the 17th century, the Fon kingdom had become well established, and it was famous for its Dahomey Amazon female warriors, the inspiration for Black Panther's Dora Milaje, all-female royal guard. The Fon were both victims and beneficiaries of the transatlantic slave trade, and they eventually became a significant population amongst the enslaved people of Haiti and Trinidad. In fact, the new voodoo slave religion that would emerge out of Haiti was directly influenced by Fon religion, leading to the first successful black revolution in history with the success of Haitian Revolution. Most Fon today live in villages and small towns, in mud houses with corrugated iron gable roofs. Cities built by the Fon include Abomey, the historical capital city of Dahomey, on what was historically referred to as Europeans as the Slave Coast. The cities became major commercial centers for the slave trade. At number 5, we have the Bakongo people. The Bakongo people lived along the Atlantic coast of Central Africa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Just like the Mandinka in Upper West Africa, they created one of the most prominent empires in their region of Central Africa, called the Congo Empire. The Bakongo got involved in the Atlantic slave trade largely due to Portuguese intrusion, which saw the Portuguese seize citizens of the Congo Empire, enslaving them illegally on a mass scale, with the situation becoming so dire that the Bakongo king wrote a letter to the Portuguese king complaining about the slave kidnappings. Eventually, the grandson of the Bakongo king was taken into slavery, and he would enter history as one of Brazil's most prominent slaves, Ganka Zumba, who would go on to build a big slave compound in Brazil under his own independent administration, where he lived like a king at one of slavery's main ports of entry. Top 4, we have the Igbo, an ethnic group native to present-day South Central and Southeastern Nigeria. The Igbo are another one of Africa's largest nations, which was also affected by the transatlantic slave trade. Due to the Arrow Confederacy, the Arrow people, a subgroup of the Igbo, had migrated to Igbo land, creating a demand for slaves and palm oil. The Arrow Confederacy captured and enslaved Igbos, selling them to Europeans, with many of the slaves taken from the Biafran coastline being Igbos, who accounted for approximately 13% of all slaves taken to the Americas. At number 3, we have the Ashanti people. The Ashanti Empire was a pre-colonial West African state that emerged in the 17th century in what is now Ghana. The Ashanti, or Ashanti, were an ethnic subgroup of the Akan-speaking people and were composed of small chiefdoms. The Ashanti established their state around Kumasi in the late 1600s, shortly after their first encounter with Europeans. In some ways, the empire grew out of the wars and dislocations caused by the Europeans, who sought the famous gold deposits, which gave this region its name, the Gold Coast. During this era, the Portuguese were the most active Europeans in West Africa. They made Ashanti a significant trading partner, providing wealth and weapons, which allowed the small state to grow stronger than its neighbors. Nonetheless, when the 18th century began, Ashanti was simply one of Akan-speaking Portuguese trading partners in the region. From the beginning of the 18th century, the Ashanti supplied slaves to British and Dutch traders on the coast. In return, they received firearms with which to enforce their territorial expansion. After the death of Osei Tutu in either 1712, a period of internal chaos and factional strife was ended with the accession of Opoku Ware, ruled between 1720 and 1750, under which Ashanti reached its fullest extent in the interior of the country. In 1807, Osei Bonsu occupied southern Fante territory, an enclave around British headquarters at Cape Coast. In the same year, Great Britain outlawed the slave trade. Declining trade relations and disputes over the Fante region caused friction over the following decade and led to warfare in the 1820s. The Ashanti defeated a British force but made peace in 1831 and avoided conflict for the next 30 years. And coming in at number 2, we have the Mbundu. The Mbundu people from Angola were amongst the most enslaved Africans according to the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, with most being transported to Brazil. It was during this period that the legend of Queen Nzinga, the Mbundu queen, who led a rebellion against Portuguese slave traders, was born. Eventually, the Mbundu presence in Brazil was so high that they began to influence Brazilian culture, including the popular martial arts technique, capoeira, which is one of Brazil's most recognizable cultural symbols that shows its strong connections to the Mbundu people and the transatlantic slave trade. At number 1, we have the Yoruba. The Yoruba are an ethnic group of southwestern and north-central Nigeria, and they also are one of Africa's largest ethnic groups. Going back as far as the 11th century, the Yoruba were the dominant cultural force in southern Nigeria, and they were heavily engaged in the palm oil trade, which went hand in hand with the transatlantic slave trade. The origin of the Yoruba can be placed between the Oyo Empire. The Oyo Empire was active in the Atlantic slave trade as Yorubas became victims and victimizers in the process of enslavement. The Yoruba were dispersed at mass to multiple locations in North and South America, with enslaved populations going to Cuba, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Brazil, Grenada, Trinidad, and Tobago, and many others. The Yoruba seemed to impact the culture wherever they landed. Yoruba culture became so prominent and dominant that the Yoruba pantheon began to be worshipped in North and South America. The Orisas today are still worshipped and celebrated. Thank you for tuning in. Bye for now.